Thank you. Right, good afternoon, everybody. So I usually joke because I have the honor every freaking conference I go to and talk to of actually speaking. I have a right before lunch or right after lunch, which is always great because after lunch everybody's asleep and before lunch everybody's just like, come on, hurry up, finish so we can go to lunch. So first off, as you can imagine, the subject of this talk is a bit sensitive, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands this was done not for commercial gain, not for anything illegal, illicit, or anything like that. This is a study in how to make a ransomware and why it's so interesting for certain malicious parties to actually do it. So who am I? So quickly, I'm actually right now on a kind of sabbatical, but I do security advocacy. So I go to companies and I say, okay, this is what, these are what your problems are. This is what you should be looking at, and help them design solutions. Especially for you younger people, you don't sell solutions as a vendor or as a technical person, right? The company builds a solution to a problem, right? I love it when vendors, and I used to work for vendors, right? When vendors come up to you and go, oh, we're going to sell you the solution. You don't sell a solution, right? Keep that in mind. You sell a technology that can help build a solution. This is actually wrong. I've got probably 30 plus years of experience in this domain. I've spent a number of time in IR teams, and some of you know me because I run B-Sides London. A couple of weeks from now, yay! No! And I'm also a board member of the IWSA UK chapter. If you want to know more about the IWSA, feel free to reach out and talk to me. It's a very cool little organization. Well, it's a big organization, but there's no real entry requirements apart from paying a membership fee, which is cheap. So why did I do this? I was actually, at the time, working for a vendor, and one of the big problems with vendors is that, ransomware is the big topic of the year. We want to demonstrate it. We want to show how it works. We want to be able to do things with it. We want to demo it properly and things like that. We don't want to show a video. We want to show them how our solution works. And on the other hand, I was like, why the hell is there so much ransomware going out especially in 2016? You know the Gartner curves, with the peak high and then you go down into we hit peak high around 2016, right? And it started to go down and started to decrease mostly because of WannaCry last year. WannaCry was kind of like the flag in the air telling people, oh shit, we need to do something about this. I just remembered, I forgot in my disclaimer to tell you that I tend to swear a lot, okay, because I'm a bit of a curmudgeon and things kind of piss me off all the time. So if I swear, I'm sorry if you don't like, I'm sorry if you get offended. It's so natural for me. I don't do it in front of customers, trust me. I have to bite my tongue. So essentially what I did is I went around and I said, okay, what do I need to do to actually understand this problem but at the same time provide a demo solution so that we could demonstrate our capabilities and our tool sets and how it compares to other tool sets. But as I said earlier, I never released this tool, all right, this thing, all right? I've never used it, and I almost thought about it, but I didn't, okay? So 2016, I mentioned it earlier, it was peak ransomware, right? I mean, this is what we saw in the newspaper, in the blogs, articles, newspapers. Every vendor in the sky was saying, oh, our solution, again, you're not a solution, you're a technology. Our solution will fix your problems with ransomware, blah, blah, this, blah, blah, that. It's like, no, you won't. And that was one of my ideas behind studying this. It's like, there's a lot of hype, and you just don't necessarily think about the hype when you're listening to a vendor and you're in a company situation. It got to the point where, towards the end of the year, ransomware as a service appeared. You can literally go on the dark web and buy time on a ransomware. Okay? They'll do everything for you, create the encryption solution methodology, manage the keys, and provide you a phishing campaign. All you do is invest a bit of money and you get a cut of the deal. Interesting, right? Then on the back end, like I said earlier, you have all your company. So you've got marketing down at the bottom. Marketing's like, oh, come on, we need to demo this properly. We need to show how our product can do this. We need to build demo scenarios. We need to show things. And then there's the sales guys, especially the engineers, that like, well, yeah, we can demo this, but sometimes we don't have a network. It's like, can we have something that's not, where we don't have to go into a malware lab to actually demo this, and we want something local, we want something to be able to do things what we need to do when we're offline, and okay, let me think about this. And I thought about it, and something came out of it. So let's go back a bit, 2016, to understand the problem. So why were we having such a problem in 2016? Well, ransomware wasn't a new thing, right? Malware attacks, phishing wasn't a new thing. But this Proofpoint study shows that in 2016, right, we started roughly very low, and we had something like 720% growth, okay, over 1 year. And although there's 720% growth, most of it were, I'd say, slight modifications on the original campaign. So you almost had, and I'll get into this a little bit more, you almost have kind of like a DevOps attitude towards ransomware deployments, because you'll see there's like a learning curve and there's like a repeat curve, and these guys were actually practicing almost, production type deployment scenarios where you would send out a beta draft, all right, test your solution. If it worked, you'd evolve it and throw it out into full production. What was interesting, though, was that the majority of this stuff was malicious attachments, right? So the black line is JavaScript attachments, and the red line is document attachments. There were very rare cases in 2016 where it was actually a URL, okay? Because I'm sure you guys all know that to distribute malware, the simplest way is to either put it in an attachment in an email or to do a drive-by on a URL, on a site, right? That's when we're targeting certain people that you want them to click on things, and that's what we saw in 2016 is that, in fact, documents and attachments were the highest level of deployment. So I actually run a Honeypot email address. Funnily enough, it's attached to the Security B-Sides London address because somebody seems to like to spam Security B-Sides London, despite the fact that we've done everything possible to stop it. And have you guys heard of Xavier Martens? So he's a researcher in Belgium. He's also part of SANS. He's one of the SANS Shield guys. So he also runs a Honeypot email. So we were sitting there one day and I was like, dude, do you have stats of 2016? It's like, I need to confirm some stuff. So we talked about it and we came out with these stats. We saw campaign frequencies were interesting. So you'd see there's basically from around February, we started to see a campaign a month. And you see it kind of starts slow, so testing, and then it goes all the way up and you get massive email frequencies, right? Massive email deployments. And this happened all through the year, and you can see there's a definite trend on how these emails come about. If you drill down deeper into 1 month, you see that, we'll take, for example, this one, right, October. So see Sunday, we start to see a ramp up. By Monday, Tuesday, we have a full-blown scale campaign, and then it dies down, and then they start again the next week. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have done operations in a production environment, right? So if you do, when you get to the stage where you're doing production, operations in production environment, you never deploy anything on the week before the weekend, because that's when things are likely to screw up, and you're going to get into trouble, and you spend your weekend fixing things. So you try to always deploy Monday, so you can deal with all the problems. Productionization, So we saw that. We broke down the attachments first, and so other is basically anything non-attachment-y, so things like URLs. But we saw mostly Word documents and Excel to a minimum amount. The biggest thing that we saw was zip attachments or archives. And there's a reason for that, because JavaScripts won't go through your typical email solutions, email technologies that protect your enterprise, but zip archives will, especially if you put a password on it. And with good phishing techniques, you can force the user to open the zip file and double-click on the attachment inside the zip file. Word and Excel were seen at the beginning of the year, but slowly died down, mostly because Microsoft actually took some actions and started to block certain types of attachments and certain things that were being attached. or stop you from running things in attachments, especially when you open them. So what is ransomware, really? So ransomware comes in different variants. So this is a nice little chart from F-Secure. And again, you see 2016, we saw this was 2015, right? Very few, but 2016, the proliferation is incredible. So we have, number one, a concept called variants. Basically, a variant really changes based on the type of ransomware attachment that you're using, right? Or the type of ransomware that you're building. So the first common one is essentially a script. So you'll find that some authors will actually just use the technologies that you have available in your environment. So they'll use things like a command line script. They'll use things like PHP. They'll use things like Python. They'll use things like PowerShell. Towards the end of 2016, there was 3 PowerShell variants of ransomware, right? So the advantage of doing that way is that you're basically sitting there and you've got a platform already ready for you. You don't have to compile anything. You just have to write a script and make sure and get the user to run that script in his environment. The tools are there. The tools are there, plus they're greenlisted by most of your anti-malware solutions. Then you have compiled scripts that are based on simple hashing type technology, so base64, RC4, SHA-1, and Blowfish. The next evolution typically is you start to actually get into crypto. So you start to get into a symmetric key system. So you've got AES, Ghost, DES, Triple DES, Rock 13, XOR. There you're actually getting into cryptography. The others, you might have a little bit of cryptography into it, but most of it's just weak. To be honest, when some of the vendors, they go, oh, we've got the key for this ransomware. It's mostly because they're this type of attack. Because it's easy to extract from the code. Then the highest level that we've seen is an RSA-based encryption. These are rare. Does anybody know? Can anybody think why they're rare? Number one. There's another reason. Yeah. That, and you need to do key management. Because even if you generate, let's say you generate an encryption key for each post, for each endpoint, you have to put it somewhere and store it somewhere, right? So you have to actually get the ransomware to actually correspond with your backend, and you've also got to manage the keys for each endpoint, and it's a total mess. So you really need an organization and a proper key, and you need to build a key management solution, so it's a lot of work. So a ransomware typically comes in 5 stages. So you've got the delivery. That's usually the phishing email. That's usually the bait. You try to get the user to actually click on the thing. Then you got the execution. So that's when you're actually going to download, the dropper is going to download the payload. It's going to start, and it's going to kick off the process. In that process, you're going to have the encryption. You might have an optional spread aspect. So, hooking into the email system, sending out more phishing emails, or just trying to spread across file shares or across vulnerable servers. And you also will put into place your persistence. So in the persistence, you're going to hook your ransomware into the startup keys and things like that. And finally, you're going to deploy a ransom node, right? So a ransomware is actually quite simple if you think about it. There's not too much to it. It's very fixed steps. So how do you get your hands dirty? So I actually come from a software development background when I was young. A lot younger. I'm actually quite old. I don't look it, but I'm actually quite old. So, software development in my time was about doing shit like this. Now, I was sitting there, I was like, I've got to do this in a couple of weeks. I'm not going to do this. That's too much fucking trouble. So, I went to a Mindmap. Mindmaps are cool. If you're developing software, actually mind-mapping your software in your software development process or is actually quite cool. So, this is what I mind-mapped out. So, badass is my node. So the first part, we saw the first step, which is delivery. So how am I going to deliver this? Well, it's a demo environment, so I'm just going to put it in a Word document or an Excel document in an attachment. Easy enough. I could do a zip, but that, just complicates things. You notice there's a theme running around this, is simplicity. You're going to get more and more of the simplicity. Then you need to do the encryption program. So you've got programming environments. So did I want to do a full-blown executable? So, C hash, C++, or should I go for something simple like a PHP or, PowerShell, something like that? Then you need to actually think about how you're going to do the parsing, right? So you're going to actually look at what am I going to actually encrypt? And I'll get back into that later. What method am I going to use, right? So what encryption method am I going to use? Finally, you need to do your actual run script, right? So this part will do the actual encryption. This part will actually run the encryption program. So you need to have another script on top of it to actually launch your encryption program and pick up where you left off, or add the persistence keys and things like that. And in some cases, the green part down on the right, on the left, the dropper, you may need to actually basically say, okay, so if I'm doing this via an email, if I'm doing this via a drive-by, I'm going to need a dropper. So everybody knows what a dropper is, right? Yes, no? You want me to quickly explain what a dropper is? Okay, everybody says nodding yes, so I'll skip that part. And one important thing, which I didn't highlight high enough, and I'll talk about that later, is test your freaking decryption. Okay, so you need to test how you can decrypt whatever you encrypt. Because if it doesn't work, never mind. That's supposed to be built. Damn. Okay, so encryption. Everybody knows what this is, right? Who doesn't know what this is? Correct. It's a Caesar cipher. So a Caesar cipher is probably one of the first documented encryption methods. It's essentially, you have a wheel and you've got, the alphabet on one end, well, on one side you've got the other alphabet on the other side, and you apply a shift rotation, right? So you predetermine the shift rotation that you want, and then when you send a message, you rotate your wheel to the rotation number. You rewrite your message with the rotated alphabet. When you receive the thing, you do the exact opposite. This is commonly known as ROT 13 now. Okay, so this is a technical evolution of that. It's a little bit more complicated, but that's the simple way. Does anybody know what the next one is? Sorry? XOR. Yeah, XOR. Okay, XOR, which is basically you apply an XOR function to your data with a key. The next one is AES, which you get a little bit more complicated, because basically in AES you're taking a block of code or a block of data, you apply an encryption key and initialization vector, you then take that block, I'm simplifying, okay guys? You then take that block and you reapply the initialization vector and the key, and you keep doing that for multiple times. Now, depending on which algorithm you're using, you've got, you can do you've got a blockchaining mode, you've got a MAC mode, so you've got different modes. The top one is RSA. Right, so that's public key cryptography. Essentially, you encrypt with a public key, and you can only decrypt with a private key. There's not a two-way lateral movement on that one. So I chose XOR. It's simple enough to implement. There are plenty of libraries in play, right? So XOR is basically exclusive disjunction, or you're doing mod 2. Does anybody know what the peculiarity of XOR is? So XOR, the peculiarity is if you reapply the same key to the encrypted data, it decrypts itself, right? So if your function's written properly, you just so if this is, if you apply A to A, you get a 0, right? So if your encryption key is the same as your original text, you get 0, right? If you apply a key, you'll get C. Then if you reapply that key, you get the same value back. That's a simple explanation. I was good at math long time ago. My memory's failing. So, you need the working environment, right? So this is where I started to get into. How am I going to do this? How many of you work with IDEs, specifically Visual Studio or what's the JavaScript one? Eclipse, thank you. I hate those damn programs. They take up so much fucking memory and disk space. And I have never been able to launch Eclipse in a regular pattern where it doesn't update itself every 5 minutes. It's like, what the fuck are you guys doing? It's like, come on, all I need is a freaking text editor where I can type code into it. So that's why I actually so at home I use Ultra Edit. I don't know if you guys know it. It's actually I like it. It's simple, it's neat, it works. For this particular code, I just said, okay, I'm going to take something easy, Notepad+. It does basic code highlighting. It's got basic functionalities. I can add add-ins if I need to. It's portable. That was really important. It's portable. Right? I can put it on a USB stick, or I can put it in a shared drive, and I can copy it anywhere I need it. Virtual images as well are important, because technically you're kind of doing something that could potentially get out of control, so you want to contain it. And remember to snapshot. So here's a story. You're going to love it. So I'm sitting here, I'm doing the code. I put the code into the Word document, and I accidentally hit enter. Guess what happened? Yeah. It ran the freaking code because the Word document opened, the payload started running, and I encrypted the station I was developing on. I was like, ah, shit. So then I go, okay, I know how to decrypt this. I'm going to rewrite. I've got the key. I can decrypt this. Run the key. Do the XOR function. Doesn't work. And I'm like, what do you mean it doesn't work? This is reversible. All I have to do is reapply the encryption key. So I'm sitting there. I go back. Luckily, I've had my code in a Git instance, local Git instance. So I look at the code, and I was like, oh, shit. Anyway, I killed that image pretty quickly. So, this one really good thing about VMware is you can snapshot every 5 minutes. So learn to snapshot frequently. It helps. So, like I said, choose your tools wisely. You need something simple and quick, because I didn't want to take too much time, right? I wanted it to be easy to deploy, and I wanted something that was going to help me. So then it came to, what programming language? Well, I already ruled out C and C++ because you need libraries if you're going to do math, and that don't necessarily have portability across platforms. So I looked at PHP, PowerShell, Python. The problem with PowerShell is that if you're hitting XP or Windows 7, PowerShell isn't necessarily fully installed, right? So PowerShell actually has some constraints on the earlier versions. Windows 10 PowerShell is actually pretty good. And the earlier versions of PowerShell, like version 1, doesn't really have enough functionality for you to do this properly. You can, but you can't, kind of thing. Python and PHP, I'm going to get a little bit into that later, but I chose PHP because it was the simplest to use, right, in terms of deployability, right? Because you still need to check that either the engine's already there or you can actually deploy it via your payload. Then I was just trying to decide Word or zip file. I was basically controlling the demo environment, so I said, okay, I'll just put it in a Word file, and I'll play around with the Word file script attachments. So how does one convert that logic into some code? So I used to do UML. See, my developer background is coming out. So, I just sat down and okay, what are my key steps? So I got to set a key. I'm going to set a path. And then I need to parse the disk and encrypt stuff. So I'm going to do find file. I'm going to encrypt the file, rename the file, check if there's more files, and continue. Now, there's a little bit thing here. When you're doing find file, right, do you encrypt the whole disk, or do you encrypt only certain parts of the disk? Let me rephrase the question. Why would I not encrypt the whole disk? That, plus you risk blue screening the machines, or killing the machines. And then you've basically lost everything that you really want to get out of it, right? So most ransomware, people think, oh, it's going to break my machine, everything. Most ransomware typically only hit documents folders and certain application folders, right? But mostly focus on the documents folders. And then what they will do is they will pass every letter available, right? So they'll go through the disks and every mounted disk, and they'll look for every share, etc. And they'll go for typical files, right? So they'll look everywhere for doc files, GPG files, zip files, anything that is typically used by a user as an end user file, they'll use. They'll avoid DLLs, they'll avoid executables, things like that. So you need to be careful with that. So this is the code. I don't share it, so if you can figure it out from the slides, fine, but I'm not sharing the code. So essentially, this is where I set my key. I'm a bad programmer because I leave comments in, right? Just so I can forget, so I wouldn't forget the key. I know I wrote it down somewhere, but it's better to have it in the code. There's cases where they've basically base64 encode the key, which, as you guys all know, base64 encoding the key is useless, because you can just reverse it straight away, right? It's the chart 92 is just to avoid certain things when you're building strings. So then you're going to start parsing your folders. So interestingly enough, what's the best way to parse a tree structure? Really? Nobody? Recursion. Come on, it's like programming 101. So you basically, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at all the directories and avoiding the key system directories. Then I open the directory, and then I look for the files, right? If I find a file, I open it in write mode. I then apply the XOR function. So this is an XOR function. So basically just taking the character, converting it to a numeral, and just applying an ordinal power function to it using the key. You write the key, you write it, and then you close the file. Now, guys, who uses PHP around here? Do you know what this does? It opens the file up to 1024 bytes, right? So why would I do that? Number one, that's a good reason, but there's a better reason.
You encrypt it in blocks because your key's got to be a certain way.
No. Speed. The simple answer is speed. So you only need to encrypt the header of the file, all right? If you encrypt the header of the file becomes useless. Because all of the information to open a file or to actually access the file, the structure of the file, is in the first 1024, 2048 bytes, right? So if you encrypt that part, the file becomes useless. If I have to encrypt a 10 megabyte file, it's going to take a long time. So if I only encrypt a small portion of it, I've basically sped up my process and I can get more files done. You've got to remember, you've got to keep this on the down low because you don't want the user to notice anything until it's really close to be finishing. Because you don't want that process to be broken, right? As a malicious attacker, you want it to complete. Because the more it completes, the better chance you have of getting a ransomware, locked out. So you really want to minimize what you're doing. So, and then afterwards you rename the file and you repeat your loop. So that whole, if you see, this is why I like Notepad++, for example, or AutoEdit. See, you've got the structure of that loop is in there, right? So, why PHP? Well, here's a problem. As tool sets evolve, they get bigger, they get more complex. Developers tend to extract features into DLLs. So my challenge was to say, okay, I need a payload, I need a simple payload where I just have the script and the executable. I started using the latest version of PHP, and I tried it. It started asking for a bunch of DLLs, right? So I got these errors. And I had the same problem with Python, a lot worse with Python. So I said, okay, fine, let me think about this. So I went back to a really old version of PHP. By going back to a really old version of PHP, it still worked, but I didn't have any dependencies, right? Plus, it was still green on the anti-malware stuff. The reason that these guys use this stuff is because it will go through most anti-malware checks. because that PHP executable, even if you rename it, is seen as PHP executable. So when you put it into VirusTotal, for example, it only shows up with five positive hits, and most of them are like unknown antivirus vendors, right? So by using this, you actually have basically obfuscated your way past certain anti-malware vendors. And that's why it works. So then once you have that, it's hard to see, but all of these files, once you've this is me testing it, basically, so I do the php.exe.php, that was what I called it, and you see everything got encrypted, including my files up there. So you essentially, you test it in your VM environment. So I have a batch file to run it. I've got some executables and a script. How do I simulate the delivery? Well, the simplest way is actually to use Word or Excel, and specifically, things like DDE. So does everybody know what DDE is? So it's an extension in Office that allows you to basically do data calls to databases and things like that. There's one peculiarity about it. You can actually run CMD in it from it, right? So when you open your Excel, for example, Excel will update all database connections, and it'll actually run the CMD command instead of actually going out and updating a database. But there's easier ways to do this, right? So this line up here, that's a DDE. So see, I'm using the CMD, and then I'm just asking it to run some PowerShell, right? This is VB code, of course, obfuscated a bit. There are tools. You can get tools, and you have access to tools if you know the right people, but it'll actually do this automatically for you. So this is actually a Russian tool called FraudX. You basically pass it a file, the URL that you want it to download the executable from, and you can set certain options. So some of the options are obfuscate, run on close, which is interesting because most of them run on open, so you open and it starts. Run on close actually does a little bit of thing, and it does certain things to the file. You'll see it later in the video. But where do I put this? Well, I was sitting there going, at the time we were doing some AWS work, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, I can get an AWS instance for free. All I needed really is a little web server that can sit an executable. It's like, ooh, wait, AWS. Sign up, Linux, free instance, 1 year, bam. My thing can download an executable. I'm not doing anything illegal, I'm just publishing an executable online, right? So is that enough? Well, a lot of campaigns might use exploits. So some campaigns will actually go further and they'll use an exploit technique just to get a secondary footing into the enterprise and to actually go after things. So the ransomware is kind of like the cover, the umbrella, but behind they're actually doing a little bit more sophisticated things. So you need a payload if you're going to do that. And I was going, okay, let's see if I can do this. I'm still within, you'll see later, I'm still within a really short time frame here. So I'm sitting there going, okay, what are the payloads? These are the most common payloads. These are payloads that you can get online if you know where to go, or if you have friends. Most of them are dead now. They've been discovered and broken apart. Newer payloads are actually offshoots of this. There's a newer version of DriedX, for example, that's going around. But you need to know Russian. Or you need to have, actually this says you need to have an in, all right? Or you need to be fathered in. Basically, these sites where you get this stuff from, they work by word of mouth and they work by trust, right? So you need to know the people and you need to demonstrate your capabilities. So you can't just go onto the dark web and just or the deep web and just get something out of it, just go to the Russian website and get something good, right? You need to know people. Luckily, I have friends. And I know people who speak Russian. This is Galex, so that's what I ended up using. So it's a simple little tool. It basically hooks in, and you can run scripts from it, and it takes a screenshot every few minutes. Right? So by taking a screenshot every few minutes, I can see if the thing is running, I can see if it's working. I also have a visualization. In the case of the vendor I was working for, it also triggered a bunch of alarms, which was good because I was demoing the product, right? And you see, it's really cool, right? So I've got a map of deployments. I've got a client ID, I've got a version of the tool, I've got the location, I've got the architecture, if there's an antivirus, the installation date, when it was last seen, if it's offline, online, dead. So, this is really cool, right? This is like a system management solution. This is how you basically prepare your little dropper. You give it a bunch of URLs, you give it a mutex and a file name, and you can set certain things. So you can do like anti-debugging techniques, anti-OLE debug, anti-IDAs, anti-VirtualBox, anti-VMware, anti-VMs. So it has the capability of actually giving you the option to obfuscate yourself, right? So this is the final product. So here, this is the demo that the guys would use. They open the Word document. See, it's all encrypted, but there's a little bit in English there. It says, oh, if you need to decrypt this, run the script. So they run the script. Nothing's happened so far, right? This is when you see like there's a little flashing circle there. That's basically when it starts to work, once the document is closed. So the user, from the impression they get, they open the Word document, they have to click on a button to actually show it in full, and then they close the document because they realize, oh, it's not for me, right? Now, this is going to take a while. Does anybody have an idea why it takes so long before the encryption actually starts? Yeah, sandbox evasion. I introduced a delay, a necessary delay for it to go out and fetch the payload from the website and everything, mostly because that's the best way to evade certain things, like, anti-malware that basically sits and monitors what you're doing. They usually cut out after a few seconds. So if you wait a few minutes, it actually works. So there it goes. Now it's worked. So I've got the message, and if we look at the source of the files, they'll encrypt it. Right? So, simple enough. So really, if you think about what I did, right? Depending on your capabilities level of programming and your understanding of scripting and things like that, the initial actual encryption part was very simple. I did that in less than a day. Okay. If you're stuck on the encryption, you can go out and Google. There's lots of good code in GitHub and stuff like that to actually look for simple encryption methodologies. The challenge was actually introducing exploits. That took me a little bit longer. Right? Actually finding that Galex, putting it to play, building the site to manage the Galex and things like that. That was a little bit more complicated. But I could have stopped at the top level, right? But I decided I would go a little bit further. So I timed it. It took me less than 24 hours to build the whole thing. That's a really short amount of time to build something that's going to give you money, right? Potentially give you money. So why does it give you money? Well, according to studies in last year, 38% of people actually pay ransomware. So if you deploy, if you think about it, if you're doing ransomware, a couple of bitcoins, what was that, a couple of 100,000, right? Or a few $1,000s or whatever. So even if you get one or two hits and the guy pays you, you've got money, right? The other interesting thing is that there's another study where victims in the office space, 59% paid out of their own pockets. They were too afraid to go tell their managers, to go tell their IT department, to go tell the security department. And that's a problem that's a problem in the information security community. Because we don't give the capabilities for people, normal users, to come up and say, oh, I did something wrong, without being, punished or being frowned upon. We need a better way to communicate with normal people. We need a better way to understand the constraints they face. We need a better way to actually give them the opportunity to actually sit down and talk to us, right? And say, I did something wrong. I'm sorry. How do I fix this? What do I do? There's a disjunction between security and the business. And if you talk to me outside of the scope of the presentations, you'll hear me a lot complaining about the lack of that security still sits mostly in a silo, and it shouldn't be. It should actually be a business enabler. We should stop working as a silo and start working much more closely to the business. So we know it pays. So of course, if you do a ROI study, well, people pay. It only took me 24 hours. There's a lot of potential gain here, right? For very little effort. Then, what about anti-malware technology? Well, by using a script, I even bypassed some of this next-gen stuff. Interestingly enough, the green icon, which I won't mention, they don't automatically detect scripts. Okay? They ignore scripts. You have to turn it on. There's a good reason for it. Because when they deploy in organizations, they stop all GPO type stuff and things like that if they have the script functionality. It's really, you get detected once you start introducing things like that Galex tool that at the end that I showed. That's when you start to get detected. But then, if you know your skill set, you know that there are ways to obfuscate that as well. So, UABA. So the great talk this year and at the end of last year was, behavioral analytics, right? Behavioral analytics, especially in ransomware terms, they look for massive changes of files over a very short period of time. There's one easy way to get past that. Anybody have an idea? Yeah. They essentially introduce sleep into your loop, right? You encrypt a few files, sleep, encrypt a few more files, sleep. As long as you break the pattern and you randomize the pattern, UEBA won't find it. Because what they're looking for is specific patterns, right? So they're looking for mass file modification.
Well, would someone still on the list to change in behavior though? Because it's not like the user was, like, if there's got a baseline of the user activity, could that still be enough to...
So the question is, normally UEBA, they use a baseline of the user. Wouldn't that just the encryption of files change that behavior? So the way that most encryptionware does it, most ransomware does it, is that they open the file, they write the file, and they close the file, and they rename afterwards, right? So that's just, for a UEBA, it looks just like an editing of a file, right? So if you actually parse it out if you extend it out over time and you put pauses in between, it'll look like normal file opening behavior. Right? Where they start to get interesting is when they look at the application versus the file that's opening. So if they see a.exe, which is what it was, which is what some of them might call it, and they start to see that it opens a doc file, then they can start to raise flags. I mean, it's not, the evasion techniques aren't perfect, especially when you start to get to this level of protection schemes. The problem with UEBA, and I'm actually something that I'm working on the side is analytics right now. It's a real pain in the ass to do, right? Because building that baseline is really, really hard, right? And I've had a lot of discussions with some of these guys. I'm like, so you work that 10 minutes or 10 seconds? I'm just kidding. So I've had a lot of discussions with guys that work in this domain, and it's like, okay, so your system works really good if you have like an office building and everybody works in the office building. Yeah. So what happens if you have an international company with people traveling all the time? Yeah, it's a little bit harder. They admit it's a little bit harder. Because a guy that works in London can, within a period of 3 or 4 days, be working in Dubai, then China and things like that. And a lot of these things, I mean, like some of the demo cases they give you is, suddenly you see this user working from China. Excuse me, my users go to China all the time and work from China all the time. How are you going to detect the difference between that and, right? So then they start to go, but it's out of hours. Yeah, but China is in a freaking different time zone, you dumbass. Fucking morons, I'm telling you. These tools make me laugh. I've seen a lot of tools that do this. Their anti-ransomware is they detect the file name change. If you looked at my PHP code, I encrypt first and then I rename, right? So you're too late. If you're detecting the change, and you've basically detected the ransomware ran on that machine, but you're basically too late because the data's encrypted already. So evolutions. Well, my cat picture. I stopped working on this mostly because I had some problems with my cat. It cost me a shitload of money. And I was sitting there going, oh, wait, I have a really good way of making money. I was like, nope, not doing it. So I stopped. I'd proven my point, basically. And when you think about how easy it was just to get that up and running, yeah, it's simple, yeah, it's easily detectable. But when you think 38% of people will actually fall into the thing and run the code, I mean, you know, that's why they're doing it, right? It's as simple as that. They're doing it because it's a quick return on investment. And the appearance of a SaaS type service, ransomware, just demonstrates that it is. So that's it, at least for now. I've got another presentation later on about the other side of the bar, which is actually defending. If you have any questions, I'll be here till tomorrow evening anyway. I'm easily reachable. That's my Twitter handle. Yes, I've been on Twitter that long. Good. We've got a little bit of time for questions, right? So we've got 10 minutes for questions if you guys have any additional questions.
Do you like ransomware authors obfuscate their code in order to try and prevent other people from stealing like their ransomware?
Yeah, they do. I mean, and you'll hear the malware researchers talk about this a lot. There's certain, especially in the compiled code, you'll see a lot of indicators of the group or the person who wrote it, because they've got certain style, they've got certain aspects of it. So there is an aspect of, you know, ownership to this. And same with the payload generators, right? So the payload generators, you can actually tell who wrote the original one versus who wrote a spawn of it, because the original one usually is much more optimized or less optimized than new ones. When you look on the deep web and you look at some of these ransomware toolkits, I mean, they sell them, right? So they'll actually give you a toolkit. It costs a shitload of money, right? It costs, like 50 grand or something like that to buy that toolkit. But it doesn't you have to do all the rest, right? And you start to see there are cases where you start to see, like, there's a certain set of comments that you'll see, there's a certain set of ownership. Like, the guys are proud of what they do, right? I mean, especially the ones that, we mentioned it earlier, the RSA public key type encryption, that takes a lot of freaking effort, man. Because you have to build a key management system. And you have to build a way to generate a key, give it to the endpoint, and the public key to the endpoint, and make sure that you register that endpoint with that public key, right? So in the back end, you literally have to build a key management system. And if you've ever built a key I used to work in PKI, so that's why if you've ever written a key management system, it's really fucking hard to get right.
Do most ransomware only encrypt the first 1024 bytes?
So the question is, do most ransomware only encrypt the first few bytes of 2024, 2048? Yes.
Can you,
it's speed. It's speed.
Are you able to, like, recover, say, like, an important word document?
In most cases, no. If you encrypt enough, because the structure is bad, you can still recover some of the text if you look at it. So if you think about some of the anti-malware vendors that say, oh, we have this decryption solution, things like that for that, it's because usually the encryption methodology is badly written, so they can easily reverse engineer. And the way that they do it is because they only encrypt the first part of the file. Right? Because then they can do a backwards, and they can do a reverse analysis, and they can do reverse, they can reverse the encryption algorithm by looking at, the beginning of the file versus the front of the file and see what kind of method they used and try to figure out the key. It's a long process, but I mean, there are some that actually, so this is file-based ransomware. You do have ransomware that actually hits a lot harder. So those ransomware will actually do a disk encryption. But they inject themselves into the bootloader, or they inject themselves into the BIOS to actually give you to give you the ransomware note. That's one of the ones when you see suddenly you boot in the morning, your machine's booted up and it says, "Oh, this is ransomware." The stuff WannaCry was basically that. They were hitting so low level, they were encrypting everything, and they were just basically freezing the machines.
So obviously, a lot of the people at this conference are students. Do you think this is a good sort of project for them to do to get them like decryption and like file handling and programming and stuff like that? Or do you think it's a bit too highbrow?
So the question is, do you think this is a good way to introduce students to encryption solution, to how encryption works and encryption solutions? It's a little bit sketchy area. It's a little bit of a gray area, to be honest. You know, I was doing this as a researcher. Yes, I did it in controlled environment. I did it and I stated specifically purposes why I did it. There's nothing, you know, I didn't do anything that's not been done before by certain other people. I didn't release it. The problem is, if, you know, in the student environment, there's no real gain from this unless you're actually researching how to build malware. If you really want a good intro into encryption and learning how to develop encryption, do the reverse. Build a tool that is there for data protection, right? So build a tool that's actually going to help you encrypt your files and build something where you can safely store your files and use them in a proper way. I used to work for a PKI company, you know, and we used to bring on students as interns to actually work on some of the code. And when you get into RSA, it's a lot more complicated type of instructions. Nowadays, the problem I have is that you have so many libraries. If you find the right library, you're not really going to learn anything by programming this, unless you build your own library. But then you introduce a lot of problems. And plus everybody's let's do blockchain. It's like, you can take blockchain and put it somewhere where the sun don't shine, if you ask me. Any other questions?
You mentioned that you had codes and GitHub. Was that on like a private repo? I'm just kind of worried slightly about it.
It's on a repo in my secure store.
Oh.
But so the question was, where is my repo, where I keep my code? So I have a public one and I have a private one. My private one is on a encrypted disk in my house, right? So that's where I keep most of my research. That said, if you search GitHub, there are a lot of examples of ransomware.
So it was just worried of having something like that publicly on the internet that someone could just download and run.
Yeah, do Google GitHub and ransomware, and you'll find, last time I Googled it, there's like 4 repositories with ransomware for research purposes. And if the code is out there, you know, you can responsibly, it's quote unquote responsible disclosure, as long as you don't use it. It's like, you gotta remember, you have to use the thing, right? Any other questions? I think we've got probably one more. No? Cool. Thank you, everybody.